most of the time, if your period is later than normal, it just means that you probably ovulated a little bit later. And yeah, like you said, it can be totally just either random or just, I don't know, our bodies are not like an exact science.
Guys, welcome back to the Evergreen Rx. I'm your host, Hayden, licensed mental health therapist, Cancer Moon, and the first to get deep at any party. And I am so excited to welcome today's guest, Shelly Ray Crossland. Shelly is an online creator and graduate student at Northwestern University. She's pursuing her master's in counseling, and she is passionate about empowering her community through education on women's health, reproductive rights, intimacy, and pregnancy prevention. Shelly also is the host of her own podcast, Situationship to Soulmate, and she shares insight and advice on navigating the modern dating world and building meaningful and lasting connections. So I'm so excited to have Shelly, also an Austin-based creator, on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I always love meeting other local Austin people and other people in the therapy space too. And excited to be
here. I'm so excited to talk today about like a deeper dive on the menstrual cycle. So if you guys have been listening for a while, you know, I have a previous episode that I can link below that's kind of like the 101 on the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle. But I thought me and Shelly could kind of go deeper on that today because I think there's so many questions in this sphere that go unaddressed, or there's just very little information out there. Things like, how do we cycle sync if our periods are irregular? You know, birth control can make them irregular, or how do we deal with hormonal imbalances? When do we know if our pain and the symptoms we're experiencing are too much or not something that we should just write off as normal PMS or other issues? And how does menstruation impact intimacy? So these are kind of the things that I want to talk to Shelly about, get some of these questions answered, and so much more that we're going to get into. So just to start, I wonder what happens. This is my big question. This is my personal question too, as I get to know more about my cycle, is how do we work with our cycle and with the education that's out there about the phases and the 28-day kind of rhythm if our cycle doesn't align with that? And if it's irregular, if it comes at different times each month, and how do we kind of address that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I've realized recently that I'm pretty lucky that I have a very regular cycle. So sometimes I think I forget that other people don't experience that. And I think, it is a really important question to talk about. Like, okay, it's, kind of like you're saying, it's all well and good to like learn about these different phases. But if you're someone who maybe you're not noticing those, that it's lining up for you in that way, or that, if your cycle is very irregular, it can be definitely a lot more challenging to track. What I usually tell people is just that I think the main kind of benefit of cycle tracking, or one of the main benefits, is just getting more in tune with your body and just like getting more aware of what you're experiencing. So I think even if you have an irregular cycle, you can still benefit from like starting to do that kind of cycle syncing or cycle tracking process, just even if it's just to kind of build some awareness and be like, so I don't know, I think so many women, myself included, for many years until more recently, like are really not very aware of their bodies or of what they're experiencing. And so I even think for some people, like they might not be aware that they actually are still going through those different phases. It's a little bit different for them, or they don't experience like all of the symptoms or all of the things that people talk about, or maybe their cycle is shorter or longer than the average. You always hear like 28 days is considered the average, but it's definitely pretty normal to have,
I don't know if I really have met that many people that actually have a 28-day. I'm like, it's kind of like short to me when they say it's like it's so perfect. And I don't know, I think that what you're saying is really true. Like even in terms of my own process of learning these things, it's so helpful to start to track on what what are the common symptoms that happen each month
Mm-hmm.
around the same time? Maybe not exactly or not as long, or the symptoms kind of fluctuate, but what does it typically look like? Especially even just like
Mm-hmm.
energy level is something I try to pay attention to,
Yeah.
because that is
Mm-hmm.
pretty noticeably different at different times. And
Yeah.
I think it's hard because even like I lean into this, the idea of like each phase of the cycle kind of coordinating with like a season of the year.
Yeah.
Cause it's like,
Mm-hmm.
it's really nice. And it's kind of like cool to sync it up with nature and to like use that as the like symbolism for what you might be experiencing, like
Mm-hmm.
winter being the menstruation cycle, like the
Yeah.
when you're bleeding. It's like, oh, that's kind of nice. That makes sense. That
Mm-hmm.
clicks into my brain. But sometimes leaning too far into that, I've found that it becomes less applicable
Mm-hmm.
to each individual body and person that experiences menstruation, because now all of a sudden maybe this month looks a little bit different than last month, which you probably would say is just kind of how bodies work.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it can start to feel like, oh gosh, I maybe I don't know, maybe this is more irregular than I thought, or um something's wrong
Mm-hmm.
because I'm not lining up exactly with all these like infographics I find online.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. I think it is really easy to start overthinking it, and especially with a lot of the content that I make around like preventing pregnancy, or a
Mhm.
lot of the girls that follow me get very anxious if if their period is late, which I usually like to remind people that most of the time if your period is later than normal, it just means that you probably ovulated a little bit later, and
Mm,
yeah, like you said, it can be totally just either random or just, I don't know, our bodies are not like an exact science or whatever. So it's like, yeah, sometimes it is just random, or it's just normal to have some fluctuation.
mhm.
Um, but yeah, I think it is really, really easy to start overthinking it, or to think like, or yeah, like to compare yourself to other people and be like,
Yeah.
oh, well, yeah, if my period is not exactly 28 days, or yeah, like you said, if usually my period comes around 28 days, but some months it's later or earlier, a lot of people will get thrown off by that.
Mhm.
So yeah, I definitely think that I think it can be helpful to know the kind of average, just to have an idea of like, okay,
Yeah.
is my cycle like way different than, like
Mhm.
um, a lot shorter or a lot longer. Sometimes that can be a sign of, I know we'll probably talk about this more, about like some sort of hormonal imbalance or something going on. But other times it's just like, yeah, you might just naturally have a shorter or a longer cycle, and it's not really
Yeah.
anything to worry about. But I think, yeah, I think you're definitely right that it's like, it's easy to kind of overthink it a little bit.
And I think what I kind of hear you saying too is like it's probably a better, marker to compare our month to month experience to our own body. Like what is
Mm-hmm.
kind of normal in my body? Since I've been having periods, are they always longer? So
Mm-hmm.
then it's just, if it's even a little
Yeah.
bit longer than that 1 month, could that just mean that it's stress, and it's whatever situational environmental changes are happening right now,
Mm-hmm.
versus, am I someone where I've always been used to a shorter cycle,
Mm-hmm.
and now they're much longer and nothing has really changed in my
Yeah.
environment, or I didn't get on a new birth control, or I didn't do
Mm-hmm.
something like that, to be able to just compare it internally instead of trying to make ourselves match onto the average that the science kind of
Yeah.
has put together based off a bunch of
Mm-hmm.
different women's experiences.
Yeah, that's a great point. I definitely think that's true, and that can be kind of, again, one of the benefits of starting to track your cycle, or just be more aware of it, is like, yeah, if you're noticing something seems really different than you're used to, that you can then kind of, yeah, look at like, okay, have I had more stress than usual, or has there been
Mhm.
any big changes in your life? Or I've even heard of people that like when they travel, they notice that their period is a little bit
Mhm.
different, which is just interesting. So I think like our bodies are just very sensitive to any change at all,
Yeah.
like even like new supplements that you're trying, or yeah, new diets or different things like
Yeah.
that can really, I think, affect our body more than we realize. So I think like how you said that, like compare it to what's normal for you, as opposed to like what your
Mhm.
friend or your mom or yeah, the average that is really just kind of a statistic of like all the different cycles and what is considered average is yeah, obviously not going to be everyone's experience. And yeah, I definitely hear that a lot from women who will be like, oh, my period's late and I'm scared that maybe I'm pregnant. And like
Mhm.
usually the first question I ask is like, well, is your period typically, how long is your cycle typically? And a lot of times they will say like, well, yeah, I guess I do usually have a longer cycle, or like, or
Yeah.
it is usually irregular, but they're just maybe extra anxious this month or something. And so, yeah, I think it is, when you start tracking it, it can be
Mhm.
really helpful to be like, oh yeah, actually this is not really out of the ordinary for me. Or maybe it is. And that's just like, you don't really know that until you really start looking at it. And
Yeah, because I
yeah.
think so much of us, like, so much of this comes from that desire to like Google when we have
Yeah.
health stuff. I mean, we all do it with like every health issue, but
Mm-hmm.
you turn to Google and then you're getting all this information, and it can really start to feel like, oh gosh, like something maybe is wrong with me, or like what you said about hormonal imbalances. This is something I kind of want to touch on because I think that can be an easy first place to go to,
Mm-hmm.
especially when there's other, there's real serious issues like PMDD or
Yeah.
PCOS that go undiagnosed so
Mm-hmm.
often and
Yeah.
missed for so long, where this is an interesting side of things that I want to talk to you about, of
Mm-hmm.
drawing that line between like allowing ourselves to be different, accepting how our body processes things, accepting that it changes over time and based off of the
Mm-hmm.
situation um, that we're in, and normalizing that, not feeling like something's maybe wrong with us because our
Yeah.
period is quote unquote irregular.
Yeah.
Um, but then also being able to make sure that we're getting the help with things that we need, or maybe if there is a hormonal imbalance, that we're getting that addressed, or if there is some other issue going on. So how do
Mm-hmm.
you kind of like work with that and take things seriously without
Mm-hmm.
also feeling like every fluctuation or something means that something is really wrong?
Yeah. Yeah. I do think that's a really good point. And it can be really hard to kind of know the difference. I think, especially because unfortunately, I do think a lot of women have been kind of gaslit or maybe just like not taken seriously by different doctors or different, and that's not to say that obviously not every doctor is like that, but I think I'd hear that pretty regularly, that a lot of women have experienced like trying to talk to their doctor about something they're going through and kind of being told
Mhm.
like, oh, that just sounds normal. Like, I mean, I think one of the best examples is probably like really, really painful periods, or, really painful cramps during your period. I think for some women that can be hard to know, like, okay, is this just normal? Is this what every woman experiences? Or am I maybe having like above average pain or something? And
Mhm.
unfortunately, I think there are some doctors who maybe are just not as knowledgeable about it, who might be like, oh yeah, it's normal to have pain during your period. But I think most people that most people would agree that it's not normal to have like extremely painful periods. So I think that's a good example where I think a lot of women will go a
Mhm.
long time of just like thinking it's just something they have to deal with. And then maybe they'll find out, like you said, maybe there's something else going on, like PCOS or endometriosis is like a common one that causes really painful periods. So I guess to answer your question about how to kind of know if what you're experiencing is more than just a normal fluctuation from the norm, I would say like trust your intuition, trust your gut, and
Yeah.
also like think about how much it's affecting your life. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Mm.
with the example of painful periods, it's like, okay, are you really unable to work or to do much besides lay in bed and have a heating pad, while you're on your period? That's probably not normal, or that's something that you really, yeah. Also, I like to tell women like you deserve to get help around
Yes.
it.
Yeah.
You shouldn't have to be extremely in extreme pain
And
for,
debilitated by it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I thought too when you're talking about it, like that idea of like you deserve to have something addressed, or to at least put, more have someone, whether that be your doctor or whatever kind of route you're pursuing, to like have
Yeah.
more time and attention taken to see like, well, can, if you're getting that gut feeling that
Mhm.
it's too much, then really, unfortunately, what it seems like we have to do so often is advocate and
Yeah.
kind of push and say,
Mhm.
you know what, yeah, I hear I hear what you're saying. I know cramps are painful, but also like
Mhm.
this is, it's hard for me to get out of bed. It's like
Yeah.
I can't go to work. I don't think that this is something that I should be dealing with, or I
Mhm.
don't want to be dealing with this for the
Yeah.
rest of the time that I will be, menstruating or whatever. And like that
Mhm.
is a perfectly reasonable desire and
Yeah.
deserves attention and legitimacy given to it.
Mhm.
And I think, especially with you kind of being in the same field as me, like with the
Mhm.
counseling world, is these things are so intertwined. Like
Yeah.
pain is so intertwined with mental health just in general, but
Mhm.
also being on a cycle, living in a way that our world is
Mhm.
not necessarily like set up to be conducive to, like
Yeah.
everything is just this 24-hour cycle, and then like, you
Mhm.
know women are kind of operating on a different cycle than that.
Yeah.
So I wonder, how you think like cycle tracking and getting some of these issues addressed, if you are noticing extra pain or problems like what we're talking about, like how does that understanding help support our emotional health and
Mhm.
mental health? Like, where do you find that connection, even, when you're working with clients or talking
Mhm.
to other women about this?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. The first thing that comes to mind is that I think it can be really helpful to just for women to just feel validated and feel like, okay, I'm not alone in what I'm experiencing. Like you said, it is true that we are operating on a kind of a different cycle than what the world has been set up for, or what men or what people that don't have a menstrual cycle, what they're experiencing. And so I think sometimes it can be easy to be really hard on yourself or feel like, oh, why am I like not
Mhm.
feeling very social right now? And it's like you said earlier with the seasons, it's like, okay, maybe if you're in your winter of your period, you might not be feeling as social, and that's okay. And that, like, I think there is a lot of empowerment almost behind just being like, hey, if I'm tracking my cycle, I can really actually, as much as I'm, as much as I have control over, like, plan my life around my cycle more and
Yeah.
just say, like, okay, I'm going to kind of give myself grace if I'm not feeling social leading up to my period or on my period, and maybe I'll plan more social stuff for um, in the other phases of my cycle. Or
Mhm.
I think it comes up in my work with clients a lot around sex and intimacy and relationships, where it's like I think a lot of women kind of expect themselves to be to have a high sex drive like all the time,
Mm.
or not even all the time, but just they just feel frustrated if there's like if it feels like a lot of the time they're not feeling very high libido or something. And so
Mhm.
I think that's also something that can be helpful with cycle tracking, is kind of looking at like, okay, is it really all the time that you have low libido, which maybe for some people it is, but I think for other women, they when they start tracking, they realize like, oh, I think it really is mostly in like that the luteal phase and the or on my
Mhm.
period that I'm really not in the mood for sex, and like maybe that actually is just a normal part of my cycle at least. I'm probably not alone in this. I'm sure other women experience this, and um, yeah. So I think with like I
Mhm.
definitely love to advocate for therapists broaching those types of topics with clients too, of just being like, okay, maybe like learning more about if your clients I don't know, talking about things that could potentially be related to her menstrual
Yeah.
cycle, like, yeah,
Yeah.
not being afraid to talk about that. Yeah.
It's kind of that idea, like, it's not all in your head, and I mean that more in
Yeah.
the sense of, like, part of it is, like, what we're talking about earlier, which is it's not all in your head. If this feels like, it's maybe too difficult to handle or you need other strategies, then that's
Mhm.
legitimate. But also the whole, like, side of things, which is we can work on so much in therapy, or we can work on so many, like, emotional things or do our journaling practice or mindfulness or whatever it may be. But there's still these natural fluctuations, and there's still
Yeah.
biology and
Mhm.
environment and all of these things that are outside of us
Yeah.
that have a large impact. And so sometimes I think it's stepping back, like you're saying, and just acknowledging this largely out of control, our control thing that's
Mhm.
going on,
Yeah.
that's, going to happen no matter what, and will affect our energy, our mood, our
Mhm.
social battery, our exercise routine, or
Yeah.
our appetite. Like all of these things
Mhm.
can be impacted by it. And I think there can be like a lot of self-blame
Mhm.
around not being consistent, not perfectly showing up one way
Yeah.
every single day.
Mhm.
And I think that can be hugely validating for women. I know it's been very validating for me too, to
Mhm.
just step back and be like, maybe I don't have to like muscle my way out of this. Like,
Yeah.
figure
Mhm.
out a way to be social and doing my most intense exercises and,
Yeah.
showing up with like the most energy every single day. Like,
Mhm. Yeah.
that's just not how like 50% of the world works. Like,
Mhm. Yeah.
and we wouldn't think so much about it, or wouldn't think it was an issue, if there wasn't a more dominant
Yeah.
perspective on like how we should be able to show up every
Mhm.
day, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really true. Yeah, our society really was kind of built for more with men in mind, and like that. Yeah, it can be really easy for people to kind of think, oh, there must be something wrong with me, or like blame themselves, or yeah, like you said, really try to be perfect or try to have this consistency, which yeah, kind of actually relates to what we talked about earlier about like it's okay if your cycle is a little bit different each month, that
Mm-hmm,
might be
hmm.
normal, and it's kind of the same type of idea of like, oh yeah, you won't have like you can kind of almost surrender to the idea of like, okay, I won't have the same energy level or the same yeah, like you said, appetite changes, or um like yeah, motivation, or a lot of these different things that people will kind of either feel really confused by, or just get
Hmm.
really like blame themselves or feel like there's something wrong if they're not showing up every single day of the month like in the exact same way. And
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I definitely have felt that too, of like how that's really helped me to be like, oh yeah, maybe I'm feeling these things today because of where I am in my cycle, or at least that's definitely affecting it in some way, even if it's not like the entire picture. That it's like,
Yeah.
I do think that our cycles really affect us a lot more than a lot of people realize, probably. And yeah.
It's definitely very freeing to view it that way, because then you can just be
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, like this is not really like,
Yeah.
now
Mm-hmm.
that means I just can say no to the plan I'm being asked to
Mm-hmm.
do, like, and
Yeah.
there's nothing really wrong with that. And I am really curious if you kind of have much insight on like um how birth control plays a role in all of these things,
Mm-hmm.
because it does kind of jack with those natural
Yeah.
processes and hormones, and
Mm-hmm.
how, if that's what people um are experiencing, like how to work with it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think that I feel like birth control has been a big topic on TikTok lately, and I think that it's really easy for people to kind of view it in these in a like a black and white way, almost, of like
Mhm.
I just have noticed a lot of creators lately talking about how terrible birth control is for your hormones or your body or
Mhm.
different things. And then I've seen a few other people kind of posting about how like, okay, birth control is also really, really important and really helpful and
Mhm.
like benefits a lot of women. And so it's important to not demonize it, I
Villainize.
think.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that it is true, and it is a fact that at least any hormonal type of birth control, which I think is the majority of, or maybe not the majority, but like if you're thinking of like the pill or the IUD.
Mm-hmm.
The IUD does have the copper IUD is non-hormonal, but the other types of IUDs are hormonal, and then the birth control pill is any hormonal type of birth control, like you said, is going to kind of mess with your cycle because basically the way that it's preventing pregnancy is by stopping you from ovulating. And when we're thinking about our cycle, ovulation is kind of one of the main, obviously, parts of the cycle. So if ovulation is not happening, then yeah, most women will either experience no period or maybe a much lighter period, which, going back to like painful periods, that can be really great for a lot of women who
Mm-hmm.
are experiencing painful periods. Then they're like, oh, birth control helps it to be less painful, a lot lighter of a period, usually more maybe a shorter period. Um, but yeah, I guess the way I like to describe it is like if you're on birth control, you do need to be aware that it is affecting you in some way, even if you're not maybe aware of it. And
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
it is tough. I saw a video recently too where someone was saying like, oh, it's impossible to track your cycle if you're on birth control because you're not ovulating. It's
Right.
like you're really not going through the same kind of
Yeah.
cycle. Um, but I don't know. I disagree with that a little bit. Just I guess going back to what we talked about at the beginning of like, I do still think it's helpful to track your cycle, even if
Mm.
you're not ovulating or even if you're not, experiencing the exact same things other people do.
Interesting,
Yeah.
because I feel like so much of what we've been talking about too is like there's so much variability. I mean, this is a really complex system that's happening every month,
Mm-hmm.
and also probably the lack of research that's been spent,
Mm-hmm.
like really figuring it out. I think even with
Yeah.
birth control, we still have like not a ton of understanding of like how it all works and what
Mm-hmm.
all the like ramifications of that are, or how it plays out
Yeah.
with the other parts of the cycle. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and that makes me wonder, like, we've touched on this before, the idea that the world kind of runs off of this 24-hour cycle, and then
Mm-hmm.
women's bodies are set up in a different way, or people who menstruate are set up in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we kind of validate, as we're doing, the real impact of that, the idea that really it is beneficial to, as much as you can, structure your life in a way that's conducive to your phases?
Mm-hmm.
But how do we validate that without perpetuating the idea that women are lesser than men, that
Yeah.
we just can't function as well throughout the month?
Yeah. That's a really great question because I think that is something that crosses a lot of women's minds is almost like this idea of, oh, I don't want to
Don't want to like
admit that. Yeah,
don't want
like
to pay attention to it. We want to like downplay, like, no,
yeah.
it's okay, like it's not, it doesn't really make that much of a difference, like.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because it makes sense. It's like it kind of can be difficult to say like, oh yeah, this actually really is my menstrual cycle really is affecting me, and like it can, yeah, bring up I think a lot of emotions around like feeling like you said, like maybe feeling even like
Inadequate.
some, yeah, jealousy of like, oh, why do men don't have to experience this, or like yeah, frustration of like, why is this, um I really I like a lot of kind of the mindset around like that it actually is pretty cool in a way that we have that our bodies work like this, that it's like almost viewing it as this is kind of something that makes us, it does make us unique from men or people who don't menstruate, that it's like, I don't know, that's been helpful for me to kind of think of it as like, oh, in a way it's like really kind of cool and like powerful almost that we have a menstrual cycle, and that
Yeah.
regardless of if you're someone who wants to have kids someday or not, it's like, oh, our bodies have this ability um to make, to make a baby. And like, even if that's not something you want to do, I think it's just a you can kind of think of it as like a unique
Yeah.
thing that like,
I
yeah.
I agree with you, and I also think that that's what's I think part of why the seasonal metaphor is really cool, or I know like
Hmm.
connecting like the moon phases
Yeah.
with the cycle, from more of that kind of, I don't know, like woo woo perspective or something, like connecting with nature in that way is
Hmm.
really cool because when you start to dive into it too, there's some like kind of like uncanny parallels with the
Yeah.
way that menstruating body works and the way that nature works
Yeah.
and
It's true.
the way that the moon moves throughout the month and what those different phases of the moon represent. Like it's
Hmm.
very connected, which I do think has its own empowerment within that and feels very very natural, very like worldly based, and
Yeah.
to have that play out on like a micro scale inside of our own bodies is really neat. And I
Yeah.
like that reframe. I've never really thought about it from that perspective.
Hmm.
um and I just think, one thing I've found that's really cool is from more of like a spiritual or like energetic side of things, there's some idea that like when you're menstruating, that your like auric field, your energy field is like a lot wider,
Oh.
which can
Hmm.
create a lot more of that sensitivity that we feel too, and
Yeah.
that like
Hmm.
emotionality. But
Hmm.
it's also kind of powerful because you're like, oh, like maybe also that's why I'm not socializing as much, because you can pick up
Hmm.
on more things. We're always like as humans
Yeah.
picking up on things whether we're realizing it or not. But to know that there's a time where that's like even more heightened, and
Hmm.
then to think about like how do we utilize that then? Is there a way
Yeah.
to kind of tap into that, or that creativity, or that just sensitivity that's really in tune with the world around you? Like that is
Hmm.
kind of a cool prospect. And
Yeah.
I think that's something that's like really helped me because yeah, I've got like, I've have that feminist drive of like,
Hmm.
no, fuck you. It doesn't actually like
Yeah.
we don't need to like over, index on how this makes me incapable of
Hmm.
something. But like you're saying, instead turning it and saying, no, that this means I have different strengths at different times,
Yeah.
and they get like
Hmm.
turned up even more at certain times, and I can really capitalize off of that the more that I listen to these natural rhythms.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely agree with that. And I think that's something I've found for myself has been really helpful lately, especially like um yeah, like I've found that I am more productive and I am more creative during like my usually follicular into ovulation. Like, so that's normally when I will be, yeah, like making more TikTok videos
Hmm.
or doing a podcast episode or something where I'm like, oh, I suddenly feel like I have a lot of great ideas or a lot of like,
Uh-huh.
yeah, more energy to be like. So I have kind of started to shift into being like, okay, maybe I'll think of that time as like maybe I will, yeah, record a couple of episodes during that time, or
Hmm.
maybe yeah, record a few extra TikTok videos just to have, and then I know that at least for me, when I'm in kind of my luteal phase into menstruation, it's like I do kind of feel this need to like slow down and just have more time to rest and just like, and so it's been cool to be able to be like, oh yeah, I don't have to force myself to be productive during that
Hmm.
time.
Hmm.
And I can also kind of have control over like, oh yeah, I know that I got a little bit extra done during that time of my cycle, so that I feel more okay with like just like resting more, doing more
Yeah.
self care, and yeah, I think it can feel
Hmm.
yeah, like you can still feel like you have control over it in that way.
Hmm.
I think even if like we've talked about that it can feel sometimes like okay, this is some I have no control over the fact that I have a menstrual cycle or something or
Yeah, it creates more ease.
Mhm.
Like if we can create any more ease around it, then
Yeah,
I empower anybody listening to do that.
yeah,
Because yeah, I think that even going back to what we were talking about with, irregularities, or when birth control can kind of change up what the cycle looks like a little bit, that if you
Mhm.
can track for yourself, like compared to yourself, and start to notice any commonalities that there are, then being able to create that kind of customized routine around it, whatever it looks
Mhm.
like for you. Like, I think that's a big thing that, like, if I could go back and tell myself something, you know, from a couple years ago when I started learning about this, and struggling with some of those areas where I was like, why is this, no, why doesn't this seem like the way that it should be?
Yeah.
It's just like, okay, well, kind of meet yourself where you're at. Like, Hayden, meet myself where I'm at with it. If there's any way that I can just work with the system or the cycle that I have at this point.
Yeah.
And again, tapping
Mhm.
into that intuition and that gut when things do feel a little bit wrong, or like it's just, you just can't kind of get a grasp around how things are going. There's no
Mhm.
consistency, there's no similarities, and then being able to really do something about that and know that you don't deserve to just have to deal with it. And I think
Mhm.
that does kind of bring up for me another thing you touched on earlier, but we haven't really talked about, which is how the cycle impacts intimacy. And,
Mhm.
you know, any misconceptions or beliefs that you hear women sharing a lot that can really kind of damage women's experience
Mhm.
of pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great question. Yeah, I would say that the more I've like looked into it and researched it, the more I've realized how much the menstrual cycle does really affect intimacy. And I think the most obvious way is just with those two hormones I kind of mentioned earlier, like progesterone and estrogen. Estrogen increases right like leading up to ovulation, and so that's actually kind of a cool, or I think it's cool or interesting that around ovulation is obviously the time that someone would potentially get pregnant, and so our bodies are almost kind of like increasing estrogen, which also makes us, or for some of us, makes us feel more in the mood for sex, or more like we've talked about, like higher energy, or things that might cause you to potentially, if you are wanting to get pregnant, that's kind of our body's
Mm-hmm.
almost like trying to help us with that.
Rev the engine.
Yeah, yeah, and then like when once ovulation's over, progesterone starts to increase around during the luteal phase, and that's really when a lot of women, at least, will feel like kind of a lower libido, and
Mm-hmm.
so I think, yeah, again, just being aware of that, I think that it's yeah, again, just good to be like, okay, maybe I shouldn't, as a woman, I might not expect myself to feel the exact same level of libido at all different times of my cycle. And I think, yeah, one misconception I feel like I hear a lot is almost this idea of like not your partner not needing you to really communicate or like talk to them about how you're feeling. So like, or even like people assuming that maybe you will always be on the same page as your partner, as far as like, oh, you'll
Mm-hmm.
just both always magically be in the mood at the same time, or be,
Yeah.
or, you know, which obviously would be great if that were the case. For most people, it's not, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes it's like really good to make that connection between your menstrual cycle and maybe how you're feeling around intimacy, and like
Mm-hmm.
just, yeah, obviously your partner can't read your mind, and they're not going to know that, um, you know, they're not going to know how you're feeling unless you tell them. So I think I
Mm-hmm.
always encourage people to like, that it shouldn't be weird or embarrassing to talk to, um,
Mm-hmm.
whether you have a male or a female partner, but like talk to them about, um, yeah, here's how I think my menstrual cycle kind of affects me, or like during this time of my cycle, I've just noticed that I maybe am not in the mood as much, and it's really
It's
not about
okay.
you, and
Yeah,
it's,
not
yeah,
personal,
yeah,
depersonalizing it a little bit. And
mm-hmm.
yeah, I think I'm pretty sure there's an cycle tracking app. I think it might be called Stardust, that
Oh
now
yeah,
has like a
mm-hmm.
feature where you can share it with your partner or something. Like, you
Yeah, I think I've heard of
somehow they
that.
get like tapped in so that they can
Mm-hmm.
see where you're at, which I feel like is
Yeah,
kind of a revolutionary idea in this, which I feel like people only started really talking to publicly about pretty
yeah,
recently.
mm-hmm.
um and making it less taboo
Yeah,
to share about the menstrual cycle. But that is kind of an interesting idea, and does seem like a little bit less like shame based or
mm-hmm.
stigmatizing. Like, this is just going to fluctuate. And, even when you're feeling, especially when you're not feeling the best in your body,
Mhm.
that's going to impact
Yeah.
the enjoyment, the desire for intimacy.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think that a lot of women experience like more kind of negative self-talk or negative body image at certain parts of their cycle. And yeah, that can, obviously that definitely can affect intimacy as well. So kind of, again, going back to like why cycle tracking can be so helpful is just being more aware of like, oh yeah, I think I am experiencing some of those types of thoughts around this time in my cycle. And, again, yeah, being aware of like, okay, does this feel like it's really, really affecting me a lot? And maybe I should look into if there's anything I could do that would help with this at all. Or does it maybe feel like it's just a normal part of my cycle and I shouldn't feel any shame around it? You're right. There can be a lot of shame sometimes. And so it's like, I think even just talking to your partner about it can feel really good for a lot of people to feel like, oh yeah, I don't have to be embarrassed or ashamed. I can just tell them what I'm experiencing. And yeah, I think I've heard of that app you mentioned too, that I think that's a really great idea to be like, yeah, then, your partner can kind of be aware of what's going on for you. And I think that can lead to some really good conversations for couples too. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have really appreciated this conversation. I mean, I think even just bringing it more out into the public domain, which you do such a beautiful job with your content online. And I wonder, I want to get your information for everybody. That will be links below. And also, if you have other kind of educational resources or things that you would point people to that you think is really helpful, just, I mean, it can be about the cycle, but also just intimacy education in general and women's health. And is there any place that you would kind of direct people to in addition to your page as well?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, my TikTok is shamelessly Shelly. I talk about a lot of this type of stuff on there. So I always love to connect with other women. And another creator that I love that I always recommend is her account's called The Sync Way, but she talks a lot about the menstrual cycle and a lot of this stuff that we've been talking about today of just, I think she does a really good job of really empowering women around the menstrual cycle and like educating us, but also, kind of tapping into what we talked about around like not making people feel shame or anything. And so I definitely recommend her. I know she has a website and some really great resources on there as well. There's a creator, she's on TikTok, but she also has a podcast that's really, really great. Her podcast is called Breakthrough, and her name is Isabella Mainwaring. She talks a lot about like the hormonal side of things, as well as like nervous system regulation, and just she's got some really great resources too on her website of like different courses and different things to a lot of this kind of stuff of and just empowering women and hormonal imbalances and things like that we touched on a little bit today. But if you're interested in learning more about that, I definitely recommend her. One book that I read recently that I would really recommend people is called The Wisdom of Your Body. And she just talks a lot about how to have like a connection with your body and like almost like developing more self-love and more like viewing your body as this like almost like a relationship that you have with someone else, which I think is really interesting. And she has a whole episode or a whole chapter in there about intimacy too, which I thought was really great. So those are kind of some of my main recommendations. But
I will have all those linked below and all of your information so that people can find you and work with you. I know you do some like one-on-one consults for people's questions.
Yeah, I offer like a 30-minute call if you're wanting to kind of talk through some of what you're experiencing and whether it's something around like preventing pregnancy or just any of these menstrual cycle related stuff. And then you can always follow me on TikTok. I do a lot. That's where I do a lot of my free education. So yeah.
Well, great. It was so wonderful to have you. And as always, you guys listening, if you have questions, if you want to connect, you want to continue the conversation, you can find me at the Evergreen Rx everywhere. You can find Shelly. We can kind of keep up the convo, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Thanks for listening. Bye.